Like there's fewer people on that side by the windows today. They're like, everybody's like kind of moving over. Wasn't the worship, wasn't the music good this morning? I don't know. It's always good, but I just, for whatever reason, maybe I was just paying attention to the words more this morning, but God was just really speaking. One of the things I failed to do earlier, and she's not here, so I can't embarrass her, but remember Helga in prayer. Helga had some eye surgery just a few days back, and so she's kind of struggling to recover that a little bit. Melvin was saying that she was seeing double, and I thought, man, 9 kids. like, just think about that you'd see 18, wow, that's incredible. I didn't even think about that, so I was like, wow, that would be amazing. She's like, I'm just going to go lay down. But I remember her in prayer. We pray that she recovers quickly and everything works out the way it's supposed to. So thanks we're here. This is it's our final installment in our Pack Your Bag series. So I hope it's been a blessing. I hope in some ways it's been encouraging. I actually hope in a lot of ways it's challenging. I actually do pray that. I pray that for myself. And I kind of carry that prayer on to everybody else, that somewhere in all of this, God kind of meets us and challenges us. But what we've been talking about over the last few weeks is preparing for what's next, or maybe better said, how to prepare for what's next. And all of us, we've talked about this every week, but all of us have a what's next coming. There's something coming for you in your next season, or in, maybe within the next week, or the next year, or the next decade, or whatever it is. There's something that's coming next. And maybe one of these or some of these are your what's next, right, that are coming. I can't even put that word out there. That's not proper. That's why I can't say it. But maybe this is one of your what's next that may be coming. We talked about, maybe graduation is on the horizon for some of you. That's something that's coming up you're looking forward to. Maybe it's college, or getting back to college, or kind of been away from college, getting back to it, finishing up college. I don't know, wedding. Some people are preparing for weddings. Maybe it's a child or a close friend that's preparing for a wedding. Baby, maybe somebody's preparing to bring a baby, or talking about having a baby or another baby. We talk about new jobs and new schools. Sometimes new jobs doesn't even mean it's a brand new job. It just means maybe you're moving into a new role or a new position within the company, and that's going to require something different from you, or some additional responsibility from you. New school, empty nest, we talked about that. We had some more conversations today about empty nests that keep filling back up, and you keep trying to empty them again, and that kind of stuff. Retirement, some of you, that's something that's next. It may not be like tomorrow, but it's coming. One of the things I forgot to put up there was death. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. We all have that coming for us. I should have put that up just in tribute to Terry. The text message that said they went through the list and death was the only thing they had left to do yet. So we should have put death up there. But that we all have something that's coming next. And the temptation that we are constantly hit with is the thought of thinking, because I know what's coming, I'm prepared for it. We have this idea that just because I know what's coming next, I'm ready for what's coming next. But we talked about this in week 1. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? In week 1 of our series, we said this: there is no necessary correlation between knowing what's next and being prepared for what's next. There is no necessary correlation between knowing what's next and being prepared for what's next. Just because you know doesn't mean you're ready. Knowing means you just know, right? Knowing means you just know, but it doesn't mean you're ready for what's next. Think back for a little bit. For some of you, think back to your school days, right? Oftentimes, whether it was in elementary or middle, high school, college, whatever it is, a lot of times the teacher would let you know, right, that there's a test coming up on Friday. But just because you knew it was coming didn't mean you were actually prepared for the test yet, right? That's why they would typically tell you ahead of time, unless you're like a lot of people, well, the teacher never told me, and that was always the explanation for why we didn't do well, which was a bold-faced lie. They did tell us, we just didn't prepare well, right? And so just because we know doesn't mean that we're necessarily ready. And as obvious as this may seem, it's not as obvious as we think. And let me give you an example. There are many couples that spend way more time preparing for their wedding instead of preparing for a marriage. And they'll spend lots of time, they'll spend lots of money, they'll do lots of planning for a day, for an event. And then where I kind of bump up against is they'll come to me and say, hey, we'd like for you to be involved in the wedding, which is awesome. I love to do that kind of stuff. But then I say, hey, how about we sit down and we counsel for a little while? And a lot of times the response is, well, we don't have time for that because we're really busy preparing for a wedding. And I'm like, that's great. I want to help you prepare for marriage. Because as long as your wedding may be, we're hoping your marriage is longer. Like, we actually hope your marriage lasts longer than, I've been to some really long weddings, not all of them, but we always kind of hope that the marriage will last longer than the wedding. And here's something I think we can all agree on. Not very many of us have seen ugly weddings, but we have all seen ugly marriages. We've all seen it. But we'll spend all kinds of time and energy and money preparing for an event and not preparing for what follows that event, the life that opens up following that event. But the assumption is if I know what's coming next, then I must be prepared for what's next. And that's not true. It's not true in any arena of life. There's nowhere where it works. Just because you know doesn't mean you're ready. There is no necessary correlation between knowing what's next and being prepared for what's next. So today, I want to share a verse with you that I came across quite a while back. And it's a verse that I've read it in different versions, but it's a verse that's just really kind of hit my life, hit my heart. And maybe it's something that I hope you'll allow God to drive deep into your heart. My prayer is that maybe you'll even adopt it as a prayer. Like maybe we'll walk through that a little bit later about maybe there's a way to word this into a prayer for your own life. And I think it's that important. It's a verse found in the book of Proverbs. And the reason that this verse has found lodging in my life is because based on what I do for a living, I've had a front row seat to watching some really, really smart people make really, really dumb decisions. Anybody been there? Ever been there? I'm sure all of you. If I asked you to raise your hand, I'm sure all of you could raise your hand and say, I've known some really, really smart people that have made some really, really dumb decisions. I'm willing to bet some of us are some really, really smart people that have made some really, really dumb decisions. But we're going to talk about other people because it's less convicting. So that's what we're going to do. So isn't it kind of strange? Haven't you found this strange? How someone can be so smart in certain areas but not so smart in other areas? Isn't that weird? Like they can be so great financially and professionally and academically, but be a complete mess relationally. Or you may have people that are fantastic when it comes to relationships, but they make really dumb decisions financially. And we wonder, how can you be so smart in this area and so not smart in this other area? Like, how can that happen? And if you've ever watched someone make a dumb decision, you knew how things were going to go, right? Didn't you know? Like you sit there and you had a front row seat, popcorn and everything. You're like, this ought to be entertaining. Like you've watched people, really smart people, make dumb decisions. And when things didn't turn out good, because we knew they wouldn't turn out good, we think to ourselves, at least I do, didn't you see that coming? Like, don't you think that sometimes? Like, especially if it's somebody you're close to, family or friend or something, and you've been talking with them and you've been praying for them and you've been talking about like, hey, I'm not sure that's the right direction. This isn't going to go well. And they decide to kind of ignore your advice anyways, and they go ahead and do it, and it doesn't turn out right. And you think to yourself, like, didn't you see that coming? Like, we could all see it coming. Why didn't you see this coming? And because of what I do for a living, I've had opportunities to sit down across from somebody and ask that question. Didn't you see it coming? Didn't you see this coming? Weren't there some red flags somewhere along the way? Didn't somebody try to warn you? And I don't know about you guys, but they've said to me, and probably like what they've said to you, sometimes people say, honestly, no. I didn't see it coming. I really didn't. Like, this completely caught me off guard. This direction took me for a ride I wasn't anticipating. This was a left turn I wasn't ready for. I honestly didn't see it coming. Others, though, would say, yeah, somebody did try to warn me. My mom, tried to warn my dad. My friends tried to talk to me. Whatever it was, that they said, yeah, you know what, I did have a heads up, but I just thought for some reason it would just work out. I've had those conversations. Like, I just figured it would probably work out. Wow. I've seen this scenario play out over and over and over again in the lives of people. Here's the other thing. I realize that none of us are immune to this. None of us are exceptions to this. There's not a single person sitting in this room this morning that hasn't made a dumb decision at some point in their life, right? We all have spots in our lives where we excel. We all have areas where we do really well. But we also all have blind spots in our lives where we struggle. We may do some things in some areas and we're really good at it. But there's some other areas where we struggle and we just have blind spots. I recognize that I might be fairly smart in some areas, but I'm not really smart in all areas. And I think it's good for us to all acknowledge the fact that none of us are immune to making a bad decision. None of us are immune to making a dumb decision. Right. And because that's true of all of us, I believe this verse we're going to talk about and break down today, I think it's an incredibly powerful and I think it's an incredibly applicable verse if we'll apply it. And so the verse is going to be found, you can turn over there if you want, it's going to be in Proverbs 27:12. And in this verse, we're introduced to two different kinds of people. I'll explain that in just a minute. One, similar set of circumstances. Two, completely different responses to that same set of circumstances. And two, completely different outcomes. All right, so two different types of people, one similar set of circumstances, two different decisions, two different responses, and two different outcomes. And so here's what the writer, anybody know who the writer of Proverbs was mostly? Anybody remember? Solomon, right? So he was considered one of the wisest men alive in his day, for sure. And the thing is, as wise as he was, he didn't take his own advice. And be honest with you, the best way to explain Solomon's failure at the end of his life is to read everything that Solomon wrote that he didn't apply to his life. Amen. That's really probably the best way to explain Solomon's failure at the end of his life. Because I always wonder that, like, how does a guy so wise make such a train wreck out of his life? Amen. And then you start to read what he wrote and went, yeah, he never did that. And so we're reminded in the life of Solomon that knowing doesn't matter if you don't do it. That it doesn't matter how much you know. If you don't apply it, it doesn't have any impact. It doesn't have any effect. It's doing something with what we know that makes the difference. In fact, doing is what makes all the difference. There's a lot of people that can sit and they can spout verses and they can spout ideas and principles from God's word, but apply none of it and make no progress in their life. Let me encourage you, that's not a wise person that you want to seek consult and counsel from. If they can't follow it up with action, then they're not wise. Not truly wise, not biblically wise. My grandfather used to say God's word and God's wisdom is like paint. It doesn't do any good unless you apply it. If it just sits in this, or if it just sits in your hands, or if it just sits in your heart, you can hide God's word in your heart all day long. But what did David say? He says, I've hidden your word in my heart. Why? So I don't do something against you, so I won't sin against you. I'm putting this here so I can actually apply it in my life, and it has impact, it has influence. So here's what Solomon wrote, and here's the verse that I hope will make a significant impact on our hearts and our lives today. And we're gonna kind of walk through this like a couple of words at a time. So just kind of hang in with me for a little bit, if you will. Here's how it begins: the prudent. When was the last time you used that word? It's just not a word we use very often, right? The prudent. It also refers to people that are wise, right? You could substitute the wise here, the prudent. These people, wise people or prudent people, understand that life is connected. There are no unconnected dots in life. There are no isolated events. There are no isolated relationships. Everything is connected. They understand this important equation, right? The present becomes the past, and it ends up showing up in my future. Wise people understand that. Wise people get that there are no isolated events. There are no isolated relationships. Wise people, prudent people understand that the things I do right now, the decisions I make right now in the present, will eventually be in my past, but they will inevitably show up in my future. It's just going to... Wise people understand that. Prudent people say, the decisions I'm making right now don't just affect right now. Amen. The decisions I make right now are going to be behind me, but they're going to show up eventually. They're going to show up in my life. Amen. Prudent people, wise people connect the dots. Wise people say things like this: in light of my future hopes and dreams, what's the wise decision to make right now? In light of my future hopes and dreams, what is the prudent decision to make right now? Because what I do right now will have an impact on my future hopes and dreams. Right. They understand that. They don't live disconnected lives. They're like, well, whatever I do here doesn't really matter. It matters. Whatever principle, whatever habit, whatever it is you're forming right now will show up in your future. That's what wise people understand. They understand it's connected. Here's what the text says. The prudent see danger. And this is so ridiculously important. Like if you tune everything else out today, I hope you don't, but if you do, don't tune this part. Like listen to this part, and then you can like jump back on your phones or whatever you're doing. And fortunately, Greg has expanded our Wi-Fi capabilities so you can play games all morning long. I shouldn't tell them that. Greg shaking his head. No. So this is incredibly important because this isn't just a Christian thing. This is a human thing, right? And the truth is, we see what we are looking for and we hear what we're listening for. We see what we are looking for and we hear what we're listening for. And this is true of you even if I don't really know you well. I know this is true of you. You see what you're looking for and you hear what you're listening for. And the reason I know this is true of you and it's true of me and it's true of all of us is because it's a cognitive thing. There's this thing, have you ever heard of this? It's called confirmation bias. We were talking about that a little bit earlier this morning. There's this thing called confirmation bias, and maybe you studied it in psychology or you've heard of it, but confirmation bias refers to the tendency in all of us to look for information that confirms what we already believe. That's right. That's what confirmation bias is. And it's a tendency in every single one of us to get information that confirms what I've already believed, right? And so here's the idea. In other words, if you're committed to something, if you like something, if you're enamored with something, if you have already decided something, you are wide open to information that confirms what you already think, what you already believe, and what you already want to do. Yep. It's true. And a lot of us are like, well, I knew that was true in teenagers, but is that true? No, it's true in all of us. Like, it's true in all of us. That's not just your teen. That's all of us. Here's the weird thing. At the same time, there's something in you and there's something in me that filters out any information or any facts that don't line up with what we already want to believe and what we already want to do. It just happens. And I know some of you are like, that can't be true. It's true. It is. You know how I know it's true? Because there's like Fox News exists and other, and I'm not bashing that. I'm just saying there's these other news channels that continue to spout what it is their customers want to hear. They'll share what their listening audience want to hear, and they'll just continue to confirm the bias that each group has. It just happens. It just happens, and it's a natural part of who we are. In other words, here's the other words. We don't look for the downside of things, and we don't look for the downside of people once we've become enamored with the upside. Like, we just refuse to see it. I won't see the downside of that person once I'm enamored with the upside. I won't see their faults if I'm completely just glossed over by what I believe to be their good traits. I'll refuse to see what I don't want to see. And I'll refuse to hear what I don't want to hear. It's confirmation bias. It's in all of us. We see what we're looking for and we hear what we're listening for. And this is what this verse is going to tell us sets the wise person or the prudent person apart from the rest of the pack. This is what real wisdom looks like. And this is what most people miss. The prudent person acknowledges what they desperately don't want to see. The wise person will actually see what they desperately don't want to see. The prudent person will actually hear what they desperately don't want to hear. The stuff they don't want to hear about themselves, or they don't want to hear about that situation, or they don't want to hear about that circumstance. The things they don't want to see about that person, or that situation, or that circumstance. The wise person will see it. The wise person will acknowledge it. The wise person will hear it. And here's the thing I'm coming to understand. There are very few people who pull this off. Myself included, times. Like, I just have my mind made up about something. Here's the direction I want to go. Here's the direction I think. I'm going to give every fact I can to support my view. And I will refuse to hear somebody else's point of view. I'll refuse to acknowledge there might be another side to this. And the wise person, once they hear what they don't want to hear, and once they're willing to open their eyes to what they don't want to see, they do something most people refuse to do. They respond. They respond appropriately. Here's what the text says. The prudent see danger and they take refuge. That when they see the thing they didn't want to see, and when they hear the thing they didn't want to hear, because they understand that life is connected, they do the appropriate thing. And in this case, they take refuge. And this is a really interesting word in the Hebrew that's translated here. It's a word that's used to describe a scout that's out ahead of an army that's advancing, and the scout will run ahead of the army. And if they see that there's danger happening or there's an opposing forces gathering against the army, he runs back and he tells the captain about what's happening up ahead, and the army would take a defensive posture because that's the appropriate response to danger. That's where this word, it's kind of this really cool picture word that gets kind of rolled into the word refuge. It's a term that was also used of travelers back in ancient times because it was so dangerous to travel that if they spotted danger up ahead, they would head for higher ground, or they would literally head for the hills. That's where that term came from. They would move to higher ground, to safer ground. They moved to a place where they were no longer in danger. They would respond appropriately. What Solomon is saying is that the prudent person or the wise person, when they see danger, they don't ignore the warning signs. They see it, they hear it, and then they respond appropriately. They make the next best choice. They make the next right choice. But now, there's a contrast that Solomon introduces as he introduces us to the other person in this verse, right? Here it is. But the simple. And it doesn't sound like it, but this is such an insulting word. I don't know, some of you guys have different Bible versions, but this is such an incredibly insulting word. One of the other versions I read used the word naive. You know, that doesn't sound too bad, but there's some other versions that use the word simpleton, but the simpleton. One of the other versions I read used the word fool. There was one version that went so far as to use the word stupid. We're not going to use the word stupid, but we'll stick with simple and naive. That sounds less offensive to everybody. But it's something that none of us would admit to. This isn't a life goal for us, right? Nobody says, hey, you know what my goal in life is? I just want to be simple. And I know what we mean by that, but not what this means by that. None of us go, you know what? I just want to live my life naive. I just want to be sold things I never really needed to purchase. I just want to be taken advantage of at every turn. That's what I want to do in life. I just want to be really simple. I want to be a simpleton. No one says that. That's not true of any of us. Solomon says the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple or the naive are the people who live as if life isn't connected. The simple and naive live as if the events of their life don't follow them, don't connect. That the decisions they made in the past just stay in the past. They have no bearing on the future. That's the simple and the naive. That I can make a host of really bad decisions and believe that somehow they won't show up and affect my future. They say things like, well, I know I did that before, but that's in the past. That was that past mismanagement of finances. That was that past relationship I completely messed up. That's what I did then. That's what I did in that previous season of life. And then they say things like this, but I'm past that now. I'm older now. Let me just encourage you and challenge you a little bit. Just because you've decided to move on from your past doesn't mean you've learned anything from your past. I hear people go, I'm just moving forward. That's wonderful. What did you learn? I don't know. I'm just moving forward. Red flag. Just because you've gotten older doesn't mean you've gotten any wiser. I've met some simple, naive older people that just continue to make the same dumb decisions over and over again. I fall into that category, both older and stupid sometimes. We're not going to use that word. Sorry about that. Kids, you didn't hear that. Simple people, naive people live as if life is not connected. Simple people, naive people say things like, I just believe it's going to work out this time. Really? How do you know? How do you know? I think that's a fair question. You have a belief, and you're staking your life and possibly the lives of others on this belief that somehow it's just going to work out. I want to know how you know that. I'm just kind of curious because I care. Well, I did that before, but that's not now. Okay, so what did you learn before? Here's the interesting thing. When someone tries to get them to see what they need to see and hear what they need to hear, they're always ready with a reason for why it's going to be different this time. Oh man, it's sad. it breaks your heart to kind of hear these reasons that aren't founded on truth. They're just founded on I hope and I think and I believe versus here's what I've taken. Here's the foundation that I've now laid as a result of the past mistakes. Here's how I'm building forward in the truth of God. None of that gets said. It's just, well, I just think it's going to be different this time. How? I think it's a reasonable question. In the text, it gets a little ambiguous as to what Solomon is insinuating here, right? Because he just kind of says, but the simple. And it seems he could be implying one of two or perhaps even both potentially different scenarios. Here's one scenario. But the simple see the same danger, right? The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple see the same danger. The prudent see danger and take refuge. They respond appropriately, but the simple, the naive, see the same danger but refuse to heed the warning signs. You know, they kind of convince themselves, well, that's still a ways off. I saw the warning signs, but that's still a ways off. That's not right now. That's not this moment. That's not where I'm at presently. I don't need anything. I don't need to do anything right now. I acknowledge that this could be a problem later unless things change, but maybe things will change. There again, kind of throwing hope to the wind, you know. Well, maybe it'll change. I know things, if it doesn't change, I know this could be bad, but maybe it'll change. Maybe they'll change. I don't know how many times I've heard that conversation in couples counseling as they're preparing to step towards marriage and like, I know they've got this in their life right now, but maybe they'll change. With the love of Jesus, they probably won't. And why do I say that? Because I want to just suck the air out of the room? No, because I've seen it happen over and over. Well, I just thought. Warning signs, red flags. And maybe that's the idea behind this verse that Solomon's trying to get us to understand. Or maybe what Solomon was saying was this: the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple just don't see it. Just don't see it. They just genuinely don't see it. And you know why? Because they're not looking for what they don't want to see. And they're not listening for what they don't want to hear. That's why. They just don't see it. And the crazy thing is, we are all inclined in this direction. This isn't picking on a person or a group of persons. This is an all skate. This is all of us. We are all inclined in that direction, that we just don't see it. Why? Because we don't want to see it. We just don't hear it because we don't want to hear it. I bet you've had this experience, and I've had this experience many times, again, because of the nature of what I do. But have you ever tried to point out danger to someone? Ever done that? Ever been in a situation where you're sitting with a friend or a family member or somebody, or maybe it's a coworker or schoolmate, I don't know, whatever, and you try to point out to them where this is going? You ever had those conversations where you say, you know, if you continue doing A, you can expect B? You ever have those? You know, if you keep spending money this way, if you keep charging your credit cards like that, if you keep pursuing her like that, if you keep drinking this much, if you keep running with that crowd, if you don't start studying, we all have those conversations. And here's the crazy thing. We sit down and you try to point to someone that if they continue on the path they're on, there's danger up ahead. And the thing is, I don't know, maybe I think we can relate on this. And it's so clear to you. Like you're in that role of trying to point it out. You're in that role of trying to advise them. You're in that role of kind of trying to wave the red flags. And it's so clear to you what this will result in if they continue down the path. And I don't know about you, but I've been in this situation where it wasn't just clear to me. It was clear to a few people. Like we gathered another 2 or 3 of their friends and we came together and said, hey, by the way, this isn't going to go well. And it's so clear. Why is it so clear? Because we can see it. And then at the tail end of that conversation, they say something along the lines of, well, I just don't see it that way. That's just not the way I see it. I've pointed out danger to people lots of times. Lots of times. That's part of what I do as a living, as I try to point out danger in some places. And you know what's happened lots of times? They did it anyway. They bought it anyway. They leased it anyway. They dated it anyway. And in some cases, they married it anyway. And you're like, why couldn't you see this? Why couldn't you see what was going to be coming around the corner? Why couldn't you see what was lying up ahead? It's because the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple and the naive, sometimes they just really don't see it. They just don't see it. The text says, but the simple keep going. In other words, there's danger. In other words, they should head for the hills, and instead, they just keep going. They just keep traveling down that path. They keep repeating the same destructive behavior over and over and over and over and over again. And then by the time the simple see and truly acknowledge the danger, sometimes it's too late. And I don't mean there again to suck the air out of the room, but the reality is, in every area of life, finances, relationships, academics, professional career, in every area of life, there is a point of no return. There is. And you're like, well, that's not very Jesus-like. I'm not talking about a point of no forgiveness. That's a total different topic. That's a total different subject. But there is a point of no return. You can go so far down a road that you're beyond turning around at this point. There's a point where you have gone so far down the path that once you recognize, you know what, I should have listened. You know what, I should have seen that. I should have had my eyes wide open. There's a point where you cannot go back and reverse the decision you've made, and you cannot undo and escape the consequences of it. That's just truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat this and kind of say, oh no, Jesus will rescue you from every stupid decision you'll ever make. That's not in the Bible. That's not true. There's no biblical foundation for that. Why? How do I know? Because I've done it. I've done it. But the reality is there is a point where you can't go back and reverse that decision. There's a point where you can't undo what you've done. And most of us understand that because there are areas of life where we won't see what we don't want to see and we won't hear what we don't want to hear, because there are areas of life that we are so doggone stubborn and have filtered out all of the information that would speak contrary to what we want to believe and what we want to do, we understand that there's a point where you can wake up one morning and realize, wow, I've passed the point of no return. I have totally messed that up, whatever that is. Relationally, financially, professionally, academically, it does whatever it is. I don't know how many times. I remember sitting with some good friends that were counselors in the guidance offices of high schools going, we have kids rushing up to us in the last week of school trying to figure out how they can graduate. Should have thought about that year 1, not year 4. Like, there's a point, and unfortunately for some of those kids, they didn't walk across any stage that year. Why? Because they had made some dumb decisions earlier on that they were trying to reverse now, and it was too late. And that's just one example. Probably not a good one, especially if you're in high school right now. So, do your work, do homework, do your schoolwork. That's the point of that, right? How many of you have ever done some river rafting? Anybody do some canoeing, kayaking? Anybody done that? Have you ever seen these signs? You ever seen a sign like that? If you're on a really good river, you'll see a sign like that. If you've ever rafted or kayaked on a river, a good river that kind of gets going, you'll see signs like this posted in plain sight. A lot of times they're posted in plain sight along the river's edge. Sometimes they're posted on a cable across the river, like they post it in multiple spots across the river on a cable as you're going along, and it's a sign of potential danger ahead. These signs tell you that now, right? This one says, last chance. They're telling you that now is the time to get out or you will find yourself in serious trouble. You know what's so amazing about these signs? Anybody know what's weird or strange about these? These are typically posted in spots along the river that are perfectly calm. I always think that's kind of interesting. They're typically posted in areas along the river, along the banks or across the river, in areas that are completely calm. In other words, there is no reason in that moment to get worried. There's no reason in that moment to say, we should probably get off the river. There's no reason in that moment to feel like there might be some danger coming up around the turn. But if you ignore the sign, You will find yourself in an area of the river that you did not want to be, and you will find yourself in an area of the river that you were not prepared to navigate. You weren't ready for this. You weren't prepared for this. Why? Because we ignored the sign. And once you're in, it's too late. We had the opportunity several years ago to do some whitewater rafting in Colorado. And we knew we were getting ourselves into to a certain degree. Like all the videos we watched were pretty mellow. And then they tell us, like, once we're on the raft that, oh yeah, we've had extra snow melt. And the river's about 3 times the height that it normally is. And everything's moving 3 times faster. Like, beautiful. Cameron was like, I don't know, what were you? 6? 6 years old. She weighed like all of like 12 pounds, maybe a little more, something like that. But it seemed like it when you're bouncing along in this raft and she's like, you're like just like physics. If she goes up, we keep going. Where does she land? Like, this is not a good idea. So I remember Maggie cramming her underneath like one of the like inflatable seat things or whatever. She was kind of like stuffed down in the thing. Didn't see any of the river. But there was a point where it was calm. So calm, in fact, this disturbed me greatly, but I was too freaked out to even do anything about it. The river was so calm, in fact, at one point, that one of these signs pop up. I'm reading it as we're kind of like going, I'm trying to read it, as I'm like, ooh, what does that mean? And as I'm reading it, I look back, and our guide, our steering guy, the dude that's supposed to direct us down the river, decided it was a hot day, and it was a perfect time for him to jump off the back of the boat and swim for a while. And I'm like, I think we should sue you if we live. Like, if we live, I'm gonna tell somebody on you. But this sign shows up in the middle of this calm place. And I'm telling you, within a minute, the rapids were so furious that there was no opportunity to get out. There was no good exit strategy. There was no place to step off and say, you know, I know we're in deep, but I want to get out now. Too late. Too late. That point, once we kind of pushed past that point, that wasn't the time to decide whether or not I wanted to continue. We had passed the point of no return. And here's the thing, in our own lives, no matter how hard you pray, or how much you try to undo what's been done, or how much you kind of close your eyes and wish it goes all away, it all goes away, it's too late. It's too late. You've set a course. You've charted a course. You've made decisions that have pushed you down this direction, and you didn't stop and redirect and change course when you could have and should have and decided, I'm just going to keep sailing on this puppy. And you get what you get. And this is true of us in life. It's true financially, relationally, professionally, academically, in every area of life. There's a time when we can heed the warning signs and make a course correction or get off the path. But unfortunately, there's also a point where we've gone too far and it's too late to unmake a decision we've already made. So Solomon, the writer of Proverbs, wisest man in the world, he says the prudent see danger and they do something when they see danger ahead. But the simple, the naive, keep going and pay the penalty. The version of this verse that I learned says that the simple keep going and they suffer harm. And this isn't divine judgment. This is just cause and effect. This is sowing and reaping. This is the natural but avoidable consequences of decisions that could have been different, that should have been stopped. But because they wouldn't see or they couldn't see, they continued on and they now pay the penalty. I can't even tell you like how many times I've sat with parents even and had heartbreaking conversations about just the direction they set for their family and for their kids, and then realized that wasn't a good direction. But now their kids are adults, and they're making their own decisions based on decisions and direction they were given from earlier. And they're regretting, as parents of adult children now, decisions that they could have made and should have made but didn't make. And that's heartbreaking. That rips your heart out to go, oh my gosh, now you see it. Why didn't you see it earlier? Why couldn't you hear it earlier? And I want you to understand, this isn't coming from perfect parenting pastor. That's far. Cameron will share with you plenty, I'm sure. This is coming from just watching enough people make enough decisions and enough lives be turned and enough lives be just train wrecked that you go, oh, there's a pattern here. There's a pattern of not seeing what we didn't want to see and not hearing what we didn't want to hear. There were some people that were trying to tell us and warn us and said, hey, I don't know if this is a big issue, but can I talk to you about your son? I don't know that this is a big issue, but man, there's some things that are showing up in your daughter's life that just concern me. I thought you should know. I thank God for people like that. I've had conversations from people like that said, I don't think this is a big deal, but I just wanted to let you know. Here's something I've noticed. Like, man, okay, wow, okay, good, I got to do something with it. But the simple, don't see it, don't want to, don't hear it, don't want to. There are areas of life, if left unattended, become so difficult and so complicated that it becomes incredibly challenging to turn things around. And I'm not saying you're beyond the power of God to rescue it. I don't believe it in one moment that we can take that out of God's hands. But what I do also understand is God has set forth some principles by which govern our lives. One of them is the principle of gravity, right? We stay stuck to the ground because gravity exists. He's also set forth a principle called sowing and reaping. And it's as sure and it's as true as gravity. And sometimes we don't equate the two. We think, well, he can just suspend the laws of gravity. Well, he could suspend the laws of sowing and reaping. He can. But I think he warns us about it early enough and often enough. Here's some things. If you have 4 maxed out credit cards, a mortgage, and a couple of car payments, now isn't the time to decide to get on a budget. It's too late. You're past that point. You can start doing some things to hopefully dig out, but you're past that point. If you're over the age of 65 and you're thinking, I should really start saving for retirement, I have some really bad news for you. You will probably work until your dying day if you want to eat and live indoors. That's just the reality. If you've already stepped across the line and had an affair, it's too late to start working on your marriage. It's just true. Once you stepped across that line, it's too late. The prudent see danger and they do something. The simple keep going, and by the time they recognize, it's too late, and they suffer harm as a result. That's what this says. That's what that verse says. The simple just don't see it, either because they can't or they wouldn't, and they pay the penalty. And there are some of you here that your friends or your family or your accountability partner or your small group has been trying to point out danger to you. Danger that is imminent in the future, even though you can't see the danger right now. God says through the pen of Solomon that the prudent person, the wise person, is willing to see what they didn't necessarily want to see and to hear what they didn't necessarily want to hear, and they respond appropriately. The simple or the naive person turns a blind eye or turns a deaf ear to the warnings and keeps going. And he says you're going to pay the penalty as a result of that. You're going to suffer harm. And I don't know about you. I believe this should probably scare the confirmation bias out of us. Like, we should be willing to go, just because I think I know, just because I think I believe, just because I have chosen this direction, maybe it's worth pumping the brakes for a second and stepping back and listening to what that person had to say. Or maybe it's worth pumping the brakes for just a second to kind of see something from a different angle. And here's the thing. We all think we know. And we talked about this last week. The very area that you think you know so well is probably the area you need help in because you think you've mastered it. And you haven't. And people are trying to speak into your life, but oftentimes we come across as if you can't speak to me because I already know what I'm doing. None of us are perfect. This should concern us because none of us are immune to blind spots in our lives. No matter how I feel or no matter what I want to believe, I need to base my decisions on what's true. I need to prepare for what's next by understanding that life is connected. I need to prepare for what's next in my life by realizing and owning the fact that my decisions today will impact my life and probably the lives of other people in the future. That when I see what I don't really want to see and when I hear what I don't really want to hear, that I'm going to do something about it. I'm actually going to do something about what I see and what I hear. And not just convince myself that somehow it'll just all work out. So we're going to wrap up. Let me offer you a way to maybe incorporate this idea or this verse into your prayer life. And you can pray this individually. You can pray this as a couple, husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, however, as a family, however you want to do it. But I want to encourage you with this. And here's the reason I want to encourage you with it, because I actually care about the decisions and the direction your lives take. I actually care about that. I care about the decisions and the direction that your kids' lives are impacted with. I actually care about the decisions and the direction your grandkids' lives are going to be impacted with. I actually truly care about this. I actually care about where their lives and the path that they take. And so I want to encourage you to build this prayer or something like it into your lives. And here's the thing. Even if it seems like everything is going well, right? Even if it seems like everything is going well, life is grand, we've got it all figured out, here's what I want to encourage you to build this prayer into your life. And maybe it looks something like this. Heavenly Father, help me or help us see trouble coming long before it gets here. Then give me or give us the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it. Help us see the trouble in our marriage. Help us see the trouble in our finances. Help us see the trouble in our kids' lives. Help us see the trouble in our kids' friends' lives. Help us see the trouble that is seeping in because of our attitudes or our negligence or what. Help us see the trouble long before it gets here. And we want our ears to be open and we want our eyes to be open to it. And then we want to actually do something with what we see and what we hear. Heavenly Father, help us see trouble in any area of life long before it gets here. Then give us the wisdom to know what to do. And not just that, to actually do it. To follow it up with action. To follow it up with steps forward. Not, I wish I could, I want to, I should, maybe it would be good. Would you pray for me? That's I'm just being real, y'all. That's the worst Christian cop-out I've ever heard in my life. I believe God's job ends when He points out the danger. My praying for you to make the decision you should make or not, probably it doesn't have much bearing. You just need to do what God has already pointed out for you to do. I'll pray for you that you have the courage, but you got to just do it. But I'll hear people like, they know what they need to do, and then there's always this, but I'll pray about it or ask other people to pray for me. What do you need to pray about? Like, seriously. God pointed it out, told you the direction, prayer time's done. Like, we're through. And then God steps back and goes, okay, now you know. Now you see. Now you've heard. Here's the thing. I know God answers this prayer, and I believe I can prove God answers this prayer because some of you haven't even prayed it yet because you're nervous about praying it because you know what the answer is already. So He's already answered the prayer. You're like, I don't know if I want to pray this. And you're nervous about praying because you already know what the answer is. Some of you already know what it is that God has been trying to show you. Some of you already know what it is that God has been trying to speak to you. And you've been doing your best not to see it and not to hear it. And you're afraid that if you start praying this prayer, God's going to put that thing front and center in your life, and now you're going to have to actually do something about it. And you're right. You will. And the question becomes, what will you do with what God has shown you? And what will you do with what God has told you? That's the question we all confront. You guys, this isn't me like hammering at you. This is me saying, hey, I understand. I've been there. I am there where I go, you know what, God? I know what you want from me, but I hear what you want from me, but I see what you want from me, but I'll be honest with you. The transition in mine and Carrie's lives that led to the start of this church was a direct result of God answering a prayer a lot like this one. I had to ask God to show me some things I didn't want to necessarily see. And I had to ask God to speak some things that I didn't want to hear. And I had to ask God to help me let go of some things I didn't want to necessarily let go of. And there was surrender and there was sacrifice, but on the other side of that, there was blessing. and grace. And we have been so incredibly amazed by what God has done as we prayed for him to help us see what he wanted us to see, as we prayed for God to help us hear what he wanted us to hear, and then give us the courage to actually do it. And that's so true, not just in that area of our lives, but in other areas of our lives where we've continued to ask God to help us see and to help us hear and to help us do. So when you think about what's next, are there any red flags already? As you think about that next purchase or that next decision or that next whatever, are there already some red flags? Are you already getting a sense of, oh man, I know that looks like a really good opportunity, but I don't think that's the one. I don't think that's where God's leading. I don't think that's what God's wanting. That's not what God's showing me. Are there any concerns? Is there something you are desperately trying not to see? Is there something you are working hard not to hear? Because let me just share with you, now is the time for a course correction. Right now is the time to change path. Right now is the moment where you make that decision before you're too far down the river. And here's why. Because now is better than later, and now actually makes later better. Making the decision now is better than waiting and waiting and waiting. Now is better than later. And right now makes later better. So let me ask you again, is there anything you're desperately trying not to see? And you know you should see it. And you're kind of doing this because you just don't want to see it. Is there something you're desperately trying not to hear? The prudent see what they don't want to see, and they hear what they don't want to hear, and they do something about what they see and what they hear. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. So I'm going to ask you if you would consider praying some version of this prayer. And it doesn't have to be this version. It can be your own version. But some version of this prayer. Heavenly Father, help me see trouble long before it gets here. Help us see trouble long before it gets here. And then, God, would you give us the wisdom to know what to do? And then the courage to actually do it. And let me share with you, if you'll begin praying that prayer and asking God to really show you and speak to you, and you'll adjust, let me just share something with you. You will be better prepared for whatever comes next. Whatever comes next. Let me pray for you, and then I'm going to have you just stay seated for just a second. Father God, on behalf of all of us, God, I just ask that you would just help us see trouble and help us see issues and help us see problems long before they get here. Help us see down the road further than where we are right now. Help us understand the path that we're on. Help us understand the decisions we make now will be in our past, but they will inevitably show up in our future. Help us see trouble long before it gets here. And God, I ask you on behalf of all of us, I ask that you would give us the wisdom to know what to do. There's so many things that seem so jumbled and complicated and difficult to sort through. And God, I ask that you would just give us discernment and you would give us wisdom in the middle of those rapids sometimes to know what to do. And then, God, ultimately, I ask that you give us courage to follow through and to actually do it. And we just pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. I'm going to ask Carl to come up for a second. We have a cool event that we get to participate in as a church. And Carl shared with me his desire to be a part of us, to be a part of our church body here, our church family. And so we talked a little bit about that next step